Hello. I feel like I'm always waving at the screen. I'm waving at like everything. I think that that's just like my way of like, hi. All right. Hi. We're back again. I'm back again with another BB Reads, where eye-kuh, and any other BB that reads really talks about the thoughts, insights, or other things that we gather from the reads that I get from my library grab and go, or any other way that reads tend to find me, or that I seek them out. This particular BB Reads will be hopefully very short. As I'm only doing one book, usually I try to stack them all together depending on how many I have or that I've read in a particular time period, but we're only doing one today because that's all I really had time and capacity for in the last few weeks. And I was just really excited to read this. So the book being Patternmaster by Octavia Butler. I am sorry, I am sitting on the same side of the light, so we have a glare behind me. But Patternmaster by Octavia E. Butler. Now this book is within a series of books. It's part of the Patternist or the Patternmaster series that she worked on. And interestingly enough, this is, in chronological order, this is the last book, but it was the first book to be published. So when I was like, okay, so before I get into that, what inspired me to get this book, because this wasn't something I just grabbed off of the shelf, what inspired me to get this book is that last time I talked about a novel of Octavia Butler's that was adapted into a graphic novel, Parable of the Sower. And so I think just from kind of like reading a few different books from Octavia Butler, I was like, I kind of want to read like her whole catalog. And so what's a part of her catalog is the Patternist series. And yeah, this book is part of it. So that's what inspired me to get this book to begin with. Now, when you go to look online for the order of the Patternist series, you're going to get a few different things, or at least I got a few different things, because again, this was the first book published, but the last book in chronological order to the series. I got a lot of different answers. And so Wild Seed is technically one of the first books, or it's in chronological order, it's the first book of the series, but I read that book so long ago. I actually still have it on my shelf because it's really good. But it's the first in the series, and I read it so long ago. So I've already read the first book in the series and the last one, and I'm kind of like missing some context in the middle. But again, the order that you can read this book varies from site to site, and so I didn't feel any ill feelings around the order that I read this book. But anyway, Patternmaster within the series, and without giving too much away, I'll start with this first. The way that Octavia Butler world builds to me is just so euphoric, because Octavia Butler is considered, at least in like common knowledge and like common articles or things written about her, as a science fiction writer, and she's also a Black writer and Black author, and she's a science fiction author, which, if you think about how much space Black folks take up in the genre of science fiction, especially at the time at which she wrote this, which was 1976, or when this was published, it was 1976, you have a very small pool. And so to kind of bridge, or to kind of get into the world of science fiction and to be a Black writer and an author in science fiction, Octavia does some very interesting things. Like she just does very interesting, like the way that I think it comes through in the way that she world builds, right? Where world building is like really setting the scene for the story, like letting you know the dynamics and the events or the people or the environment at which the story is taking place, and how that influences the characters, or how that influences the story and all of that. And I just think that Octavia Butler just does a phenomenal job with like world building. Having read a few different things that she has written, she does a phenomenal job with world building, and doing so in the context of science fiction, doing so from a place of like reality as it is, and especially as it was in her time, but also in the context of like playing around with these questions of what is humanity and how does humanity organize itself, which I've been pondering a lot lately. But how does humanity organize itself? What is the future of humanity? Do we like the future that humanity is moving towards, or what ways can we change it? In what ways can we think differently and envision differently the future of humanity? Which seems like questions that we don't need to think about, right? Because humanity as is feels as modern as it's going to get, or as futuristic as it can get. But obviously there's so much evolution and so much things happening. And so again, especially with like where we are now, Octavia Butler just does an amazing job at like really pondering those questions and playing around with them, and then creating this scene and this world and this story that attempts to not fully answer those questions, even though I think that in a lot of ways she does. But I think that, again, she plays around with that question and really tries to not just envision like, well, what will humanity look like in 2 years, or not even just like in a sense of time, but in a sense of the dynamics that we have now. What is the future of humanity, of, what's currently happening in our world and all of these things, and she plays around with it and she envisions into these different possibilities and into these different realities kind of created by the dynamics that we live in. And that she's lived in her time, and creates just these just very wonderful stories. Wonderful, but just these very personal stories that may not be so relatable because they draw on these different elements that feel so far out. But then somehow, I don't know, for me, somehow it still feels very in your face and very this makes sense for where we are today, even in the fantastical sense, even in the idea that this is science fiction, meaning that it's fake or imaginatory or something like that. It's deriving from the imagination. It still feels rooted, even though it deals kind of with maybe some fantastical elements, or maybe some elements that have been turned up to the extreme or turned down to their lowest points. But still, she just plays very well in that muck of the answering of that question to create these very solid, reliable stories. Making sure. Okay. Making sure my packaging get dropped off. Anyway, so that's the first thing that I'll say. And then about the book itself, about Patternmaster itself, it explores, and I'll just kind of adapt from the tab, or take from the tab a little bit. So patternists are psionically powerful, selectively bred. It's a selectively bred race. And essentially the patternists can access or communicate and relay messages, or do quite a bit of things through the pattern, which is kind of this intuitive sense and connection. And I guess in my mind, if I had to picture, it's kind of this neural network, and the patternists have access to these neural networks, and that this neural network can tell you a bunch of information about who you're around, if you're compatible with that person, their relation to you. It can tell you their stories, it can tell you their memories, it can tell you the things that they're thinking in that moment. And also, if you're good at being a patternist, or if you have worked the skill of being a patternist, can you work with that to do a myriad of things? You can create a shield, you can I think even in the story, you can harm someone else within the pattern by how you access and work and manipulate the pattern, this neural network. And so you have this selectively bred, powerful race of patternists, and then you have the Clayarchs, and then you have the mutes, right? Mutes are the ones who cannot access the pattern. So they would be, I think, and it's very funny, again, to my first point, that the mutes are considered people who cannot access the pattern. But like they would be considered, and I think how Octavia Butler describes them, like at some point in the story, like they would just be like humans without intuitive abilities, essentially. Like, but they still have other skills, but because they aren't patternists, in this hierarchical world, right? Like they're not the top tier. They work as servants to the patternists, but they would be like your landscapers, your gardeners, your cooks, your chefs, your working class folks, really. And so this is where I get at where it's like, it's very much so reality as is, but it kind of, like, she manipulates concepts and just kind of like through this particularly built world still speaks to the dynamics that exist within the reality that we know as humans. And again, plays around with that. And then you have the Clayarchs, which, again, because this is the last book within the series and the first to be published, and because there's so many different kind of like sites saying which order to read them, there's a few that I haven't really read yet, and so like I'm kind of missing the context as to how the Clayarchs got there. Like, you know, in the story they're just kind of like a normal occurrence, or contender within the whole thing, but I don't really understand how the Clayarchs came to be just yet. But like the story kind of gets into it just a tad bit, and when I was reading, I was like kind of peaked. But yeah, then you have the Clayarchs, who are I want to say they went to space or something like that, and they were humans who went to space, and they mutated into like a half sphinx-like creature mixed with like humans, and they know how to use guns. So it's wild. Like, really, the kind of like the kind of characters that you have in this story, and like how they are in dynamic with each other. So yeah, you have these kind of like three races, but the story focuses on a conflict between folks and siblings within the pattern who are patternists, and how they work together, and or how they are in conflict with one another in order to become the Patternmaster. So the one who holds all of the patterns, who can access all of the patterns no matter where you are, no matter what you do. They don't necessarily they do have influence and control, but they because it's more widespread, you have to be very, very gentle and powerful and considerate of what it means to be a Patternmaster. Because the current Patternmaster is dying, and so now one who wants to take the throne of Patternmaster is in conflict with someone who has equal potential to do so as well. And so you have this story of conflict, and then also because the hierarchical order of race, of class, and of less class, but of gender even, can create this it can just kind of it like influences the characters' decisions in order to be able to just contend with the total reality that they're existing in. And again, I don't want to give too much of the book away, so that's why I'm being a little bit vague. But yeah, maybe I'm like, it wouldn't be too bad. I feel like I've talked more in depth with the characters, even when I didn't want to spoil it for anyone else. But Teray is one of the characters. I will say this because I think it's important. So the Patternmaster his name is Rael, and Octavia Butler does this a lot within her novels too, where she plays around with or contends with relationship dynamics as it relates to just ideas and the dynamics of I won't say romantic partnership, but just just the idea of like love and bringing together who's marrying who has a right to marry, who has like, all of these kinds of things. Who likes who, why do they like them? Like, she's answering those questions too. So even when she's like, what is the future of humanity? She's also doing that in the context of like, how does that influence our relationships? How does that influence how we're able to relate to one another? And she especially does that when it comes to relationships of like sexual relationships or sensual relationships. And relationship orientation, just kind of those kinds of things, or especially cis hetero dynamics. Like, she plays around with that quite a bit. And so you have Rael, who's the Patternmaster, who is currently the Patternmaster, but he's dying at this point. So there needs to be someone to take over the pattern, because with him dying and him getting weaker, his ability to protect the patternist in the world and all of these things relies on his being able to have the strength to do it, but he doesn't have the strength to do it. But he's had all of these children. I think it's like 100 and something children. And just even the thought of that, right? Like that, hold on. All right. So yeah, just because just the fact that he's had all of these children, and within this world too, there's not a responsibility to care for your children. There's not really a responsibility. Like, you can have them and let them go to wherever, let them be raised by the school, let them be raised, which interesting dynamic, right? Interesting dynamic that she's speaking to. But like, yeah, you can like let them go out into the world. Like, they don't really need the nurturing and the care and like any of that. You're being built up as a patternist has more to do with school and like learning, and also your place in society when you're first born. So Rael has all these children. He doesn't really have to take care of them, even though he's a Patternmaster and also human. Like, let's be real, he's a patternist, but he's a human patternist. And he let me see. So he has all of these kids. One kid grows up there's also a thing called an outsider, which isn't like a patternist. Like, an outsider is someone who doesn't have their own house, or they're not necessarily a mute, but they also are not a patternist, or like a pattern, like someone who has their own house to be able to take apprentices and like do all of these things. So there's like these like subgroups even within like the main 3 racial classes, racial castes. So he has all of these kids. One is an outsider, but one has kind of worked their status up to being able to have their house and to have apprentices and to do all of these things. And so they're both contending for, one is more sincere and, or not sincere, very much so head first and like very cutthroat at being able to get the Patternmaster seat. The other one is like, I'm just one of 100 sons of Rael. Like, I at most he wants his own house, right? But they end up meeting each other, and yeah, like the one who wants the seat wants to eliminate and make sure that all like competition is like, he want to dead that before it could even happen. And so because of that, because one of them, or the other one, is an outsider, and he doesn't really have his own house. He doesn't have any kind of status to keep this person, and he's not as strong. He's strong, but he's not as strong to be able to manipulate the pattern, to be able to kind of like gain control, or to like really exercise his own freedom. This is a concept that will be talked about a lot within this series too. But to exercise his own freedom, and in order to kind of contend with these goals, or kind of go after these goals, and because they also find out that they're siblings, right? the one who is more hot for the seat, it's like, well, how about you can have all of that, but you have to let me control you. You have to kind of give up some form of freedom that you would desire to have in order to exist and to do these things that you want to. So these characters are in conflict because he doesn't want to give up freedom. He also wants to have his own house. He wants to be protected. And one wants to just have the seats of the Patternmaster while also being able to control certain people or certain folks who ultimately not overthrow his power. He wants to be the most powerful one. So yeah, you have a lot of like conflict, but you have these conflicts within specific dynamics that demand specific things. And Octavia Butler just kind of helps. This book moves a little quickly, but she does still move it in a way that's like, child, you can ask those questions. Like I'm leaving certain things, not necessarily leaving certain things open, but I guess there are certain things that can be interpreted a few different ways. And also, it still has to be interpreted in the context of this reality, and in the context of the reality, or in the context of the questions that we're asking about and of humanity. And so it breeds very interesting concepts. It breeds very, very, very interesting concepts. And an interesting story. And with that, I'm like, I would definitely have this book on my bookshelf. I would have all of Octavia Butler's books on my bookshelf, because for the world building alone, this is something that I would be excited to read again, even, and read with other folks to kind of just like digest and dissect. And really, I'm always like, what were you thinking? Like, what were you considering? And like, what was the reality that Octavia Butler was considering when she was developing these stories? Because so much goes into writing. And I think like that's what I love about Octavia Butler, because she inspires me as a writer to like, it takes so much effort as a writer to have these kinds of ideas and to put them into a cohesive story, and for it to be smart and intelligent and wise and all of those things too. It takes so much effort to do that. Some more or less for others and all of those things, but still wanting to recognize the effort that she put in creating such the stories and such the things that she did create in her lifetime, in her writings. And so I'm always, when I read these things, I'm like, what was she thinking? Like, what was she really envisioning of the world of humanity, especially as she was once again contending with her own reality at which was present to her, reconciling with that, wanting to see visions and futures for hope, because she does that well too, where it's like, not even just in this very false way of like, I'm grabbing onto hope, but just kind of the determination of humans to desire freedom and to desire liberation and all of those things, and in the dynamics that we have to push against or to move through in order to make that possible. She just does so well with like bringing that to the forefront of the mind and in thinking. And I won't say that it gives me better hope for the world that we exist in. Absolutely not. But I do think that, what she does very well is just kind of capture the human drama. Yeah. As it is and as it can be. And so, yeah, with that, my ode to Octavia Butler and the Patternmaster. Hopefully I get to read the other series. And yeah, I'll be back on BB Reads to talk about them. With that, until next time.